You know,
Howdy do-da day.
where's Bill? Where's our producer? Bill, are you there? Can you come on with us a second, Bill? Everybody, you guys know Bill. He's our producer. He's with KGRADB.com, and you might also know him from a couple of hit movies, including Brighton Beach Memoirs,
French Connection,
A Bronx Tale, and Goodfellas. But he, if you go to the credits, you won't find his name. He's listed under Naked Boy by Fire Hydrant. He was young at the time, though. But,
he's the new Mission Impossible, you bastard. He's in that.
I was the guy who took out your mailbox.
Yeah. Oh, God. I knew it. Only a New Yorker. Good evening, everybody. Good evening and welcome to Dead Air Live on the Dead Air Full Spectrum channel, as well as KGRDB.com, KGRA on YouTube, and also on Facebook. No, Bill, why does the software not allow us to have kind of a musical underlay once we come on? You know, I mean, Johnny Carson had his Doc Severin, and we don't have any way of playing music, or, you know, when, you know, Ken has his particular moments of brevity, we don't have a laugh track. Can you look into that for us, Ron?
Actually, if you look at the bottom of StreamYard, there is a music area. Did you notice that?
No.
See, I noticed that.
See,
nobody told me. I missed the memo.
Ken, I've never tried it. I mean, you want to experiment with it, that's up to you. I can get on the drums. Like.
Those of you tuned in tonight, just bear with us. We're
break out the car playing cards.
I promise there'll be a show eventually.
No, thank you guys for joining us tonight. Very special guest, Chris Rondina, and hopefully Mr. Ron Murphy. Thank you, Bill. We'll send a check in the mail. Hey. There you go. So we're all going to light our candles at this time.
Yeah.
And sing Kumbaya.
That's pretty good. That's
you got to show me where the hell that's at. That's interesting. It's included on it.
Yeah, we got it.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll tell you what. We've got the perfect situation right now. All right, we got a lot of stuff to cover tonight. All right, that's enough of that, Ken. Jesus. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, also the thumbs up and the reminder bell for upcoming content. Look at have some fun tonight because we got two great guys that are going to be joining us, and some adventures, some experiences, some travel,
you bet,
and some perspectives also. My name is George Lopez. With me, as always, is Mr. Ken DaCosta, and we thank you guys for landing right here on our Sunday night show, the best in paranormal discussion, topics, and guests. So, without any further ado, Ken, I would love for you to bring our two guests on, and let's get this party started.
Sure, I can do that. We are welcoming back to the show both guests, and we wanted to get them back on actually for the 2-hour block to talk about something that we absolutely love, and that's the idea of legends, mythology, and folklore as far as how it pertains to the paranormal. And our two gentlemen that are joining us tonight are accomplished authors, and they've spent most of their adult life researching and writing about folklore and legends and how they apply to the paranormal. So it all works out. So we're going to bring them on right now. Would you please welcome our guests, Christopher Rondina and Ronald Murphy.
Hello there, gentlemen. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you okay. You know what?
Here.
You're doing this on your phone?
Well, this is the whole problem that we're having right now. We're having issues for some reason at different places. So I have my laptop right here. Because it was giving me problems coming on, I'm logging back in again. I shut everything down. I'm logging back in again. So I'm going to be jumping over to that as soon as everything comes up.
Because I was going to say, if you stay on your phone, you can give it the old 180 turn and we can get a nice wide picture of you.
Oh, yeah, we could do that. Let's see here. Let's see. Does that work?
Oh, give it a second. There it is. No, turn it back.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
hey, there we go. Excellent. Excellent.
Nailed
Yes.
it. You look like you're in a little box there right now. But
right.
Guys, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Hold on. What the hell is that behind your head there, Ron?
That's a deer. It's
a little tiny deer. A deer?
Well, that's a big one in Pennsylvania. In Western Pennsylvania, that's like as big as they get. They're about the size of a German Shepherd around here.
A little doe-eyed little deer. I'm accessing my Marissa Tomei from my cousin right now.
And I will actually, for complete disclosure here, that's not my deer. It's my father's. My father passed away last year, so in memory of him, I have his various deer mounts hanging around my house.
Oh, okay.
And I think it helps with my street cred though too. I'm always supposed to be outdoors and everything, so it's like a little bit of of course I go out there and do this all the time.
Yeah, you're rocking the plaid. You got the beard going and everything.
I got the beard. Yeah.
But you're not. Yeah, I mean, you don't see Chris Rondino there with a vampire head on his wall. Nothing like that.
Oh, I'll pull one out if you really need me to. I try to keep these
the
things
less we know about that, the better. I think.
Yeah. Keep it
denial. I was
a
vampire officer.
I don't want to have to testify on that behalf. But guys, thank you for joining us again.
Yes,
something near and dear to our hearts. We love stories. We love legends. We love mythology. And we are going to talk about, not only talk about it tonight, but for our audience, we have people that have actually been to some of these locations. When you hear of Frankenstein's castle, it is in some type of James Whale movie. No, it actually exists. Same thing with Dracula's castle. And of course, Legend of Sleepy Hollow, just to give you some kind of introduction to where we're going. So we're going to have some pictures of that tonight to show you, and we're going to get into how all this plays into this wonderful thing we call the paranormal tonight with two very accomplished guests. So can't wait to get started.
Looking forward to it.
I'm a little frightened of these monsters. I mean, growing up, that was our horror movies in our day. Frankenstein, Dracula, the creature from the Black Lagoon, the Wolfman. All masterfully done by masterful actors at the time. And then you get to the point in time where you wind up getting those models where they're probably about 8-10 inches in height, and take them home and you glue them together.
The old Aurora plastic models. Love them.
Yes. It was part of our childhood, so this is interesting to me to know that, you step foot on the actual soil of these locations, and we're definitely going to hear about your experiences, and we're going to talk about lore and legends tonight. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So Ken, why don't you start us off, sir?
Sure. I also want to remind our viewers tonight that we'll be taking your calls eventually sometime tonight, as we normally do. And I'm going to ask you a favor tonight. If you, in your hometown, have some type of legend, I'm going to ask you to give us the abbreviated version of it, so we can, let others call in as well. I know that there are backstories behind this. Yes. But if in your town there's a legend or something that you want to bring to the table, maybe we've heard of it before. But I think we'll jump right in tonight with the idea of the paranormal and legendary creatures or legendary stories, and how these kind of things evolved and how they've managed to permeate themselves into our culture, into our popular culture, into our movies, into our literature. So what is it about a scary story that's the most attractive thing to people, and why do we crave it so much, and why do we expound on it and add our own things to it? So Ron, if you want to kick it off tonight, give us some of your thoughts on that.
Well, I think that this is one of the things that is so enjoyable for me in this field, because I really like to mine the vastness of the human experience. And when we talk about the paranormal, we necessarily have to talk about folklore, because nothing is created out of a vacuum. It all comes from someplace. And I think it was very apt of you to begin the show talking about Frankenstein and Dracula, because these are two of these archetypical characters that we have, and they both began in our collective imagination from stories. They were based in fact. You have to have some kernel of fact there, because if you didn't, it would not seem plausible. So whenever Mary Shelley was, they gathered together in a little chateau, and they tried to scare themselves. They tried to come up with a story that was so horrific that it would outdo the other writers. So you can imagine a group of writers in there, together with Shelley, and it just trying to scare the dickens out of each other. And she knew that there was a lot of work being done in the idea of corpses, and not only in reanimation, but also in the actual science of getting into cadavers, something that was frowned upon. But, this was the time whenever things were going into a more modern age, and things weren't looked at so superstitiously anymore. There was an edge of science to it now. And she was very adept at creating a very lifelike scenario where a scientist was able to reanimate a corpse. That is the essence of Frankenstein, isn't it? Or the new Prometheus. This was the idea of humankind playing God, and what happens whenever your creation kind of disappoints you and turns on you. It means something to us, not only from a religious aspect, but also in the idea of what happens whenever we take science too far. There's a lot of warnings in here, warnings about playing God, warnings about going into those arts that was supposed to heal, instead of trying to bring back things to life that are better left, dead. And that's the essence of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, right? And that's why it's still popular with us even to this day. One of the other writers within that group that Shelley was writing with, whose name escapes me because he was not as good of an author as Shelley, but he wrote a story about a vampire. So it's very interesting that within that little group, you have a story coming out about a vampire and about Frankenstein. But without Dracula, we would not have this idea of the way we have it now of what a vampire is. Now, historians have known about Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Tepes, for a long time. In Romania, he's looked almost as a George Washington figure. He is one of these types of figures that was very much a man of his day. He was not as, he was as cruel as everybody else around him. So whenever, look at this, perfect. Somebody already came down here with all the names of everybody there that was at the, was writing. So this is great. So, so we know from the historical record about that guy right there with a great beard and mustache. But yeah, so he was a cultural figure. He was a historical figure that we knew, existed, and people knew about him, and people adapted stories around him. But it wasn't until Bram Stoker came around that he actually really kind of brought it, forward to the point that we now have him associated with a vampire, the vampire, the Strigoi, what have you, throughout, probably for the rest of eternity. But again, we talk about the idea of mythology, the idea of folklore. All of it is based upon some sort of factual detail. Something happened. Now, myth making comes out of events. And those events then become legendary. And that is how we have these stories to this day. So as a researcher, especially whenever I look at things like Bigfoot, I necessarily have to go with, the earliest the earliest accounts of these kind of encounters or what have you. So you have to look at First Nation encounters or the Native American Indian encounters, and then we take it from there. And we see that every generation is going to take these archetypes that we have, and they're going to adapt them, and they're going to add to them, and they're going to subtract from them until they become uniquely ours. Everybody's going to have this, and it's a really incredible thing to see. Especially the way I write is I like to look throughout the entire timeline of the creation of these monsters.
Yeah. And Chris, I'm going to let you expound on that, but talk to us a little bit about the great significance of actual historic figures. We talked about Vlad Tepes and Frankenstein, of course. There is, someone behind that, and a little later on, we're going to talk Sleepy Hollow. But there are actual historical figures involved in these. How do you think that informed, or why did people like Mary Shelley and so forth actually go toward historic figures? Does that add a little more credibility, or is that just a little scarier knowing that, hey, this person could actually exist or did?
Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is actually an excellent, launching point. Number one, because in addition to being probably one of the greatest horror novels ever written, it's also considered to be almost canonically the first science fiction novel. And really it kind of straddles the line between science fiction and horror. Very horrific concepts behind resurrection of corpses, but also it was not in any way fueled by magic. And so it is largely considered the first great science fiction novel. And it's something that a lot of people have pointed out that in a modern context, people have sometimes tried to delegitimize the role of women in science fiction, claiming that somehow men have some kind of a leg up in the science fiction field. But the truth is that the genre of science fiction was realistically launched by a woman. And at the time that Frankenstein was published in 1818, it was considered scandalous, to say the least, because the concepts of resurrection and playing God were considered so shocking in this age where we were sort of right on the edge of the real age of reason, but still very stuck in a religious sort of worldview. And so she published it anonymously, and people believed that it was actually written by her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley. And later, when it became known that it was written by a woman, that only added to the scandal of the story.
Sure.
But when Shelley, Polidori, Byron, and Mary Shelley were all together at the Villa Diodati in 1816 on Lake Geneva, got together for this very rainy weekend. And yes, as Ron was mentioning earlier, they challenged themselves to entertain themselves because the weather was so dreadful. They really were locked inside. So they challenged themselves to write ghost stories over the course of the weekend and try and scare each other. And the only significant works that came out of that were Polidori's story, The Vampire, which is considered the first real vampire story in the English language, and Shelley's Frankenstein, the genesis of Frankenstein. She didn't write the whole book in that weekend, but the genesis of Frankenstein came out of that weekend. And at that time, as I say, we're sort of in the age of the dawn of reason. People, the medical industry was beginning to progress by leaps and bounds. But one of the scientific areas of study that was becoming more well known was galvanism, I believe named after Giulio Galvani. And galvanism, the idea of electricity as a way to sort of infuse life. And that's how that ends up finding its way into the story. So she used the history and the real science of galvanism as one aspect of the story. And it's hard to say for certain how much she knew about the Frankenstein family at that time. But what the historic element in that is that there was a real Frankenstein family, and they still exist to this day. There's actually a village in Germany, in Bavaria, called Frankenstein, although ironically, this is not where Castle Frankenstein is located. Castle Frankenstein is located in Darmstadt, or Eberstadt, a suburb of Darmstadt, a little town in Germany. That's the sign that leads to Castle Frankenstein, which I have to say was a bit of a fun adventure. And uh, the Frankenstein family has had that castle up onto that mountaintop for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, when I think it was in the 1600s, it was in the mid 1600s. One of the children born in the castle was a young man by the name of Johann Conrad Dippel, and he became an alchemist. And during the course of his lifetime, he got involved in the study of not just galvanism, but also in attempting to breathe life into cadavers. Now, it's believed that he primarily worked with animal bodies, trying to infuse life into them, but he is believed to be sort of the progenitor, the model after which Dr. Victor Frankenstein is modeled. And so she did what most good authors do. She rolled real world events and even some real world characters, kind of gave them a new coat of paint and rolled them into this cautionary tale about sort of challenging the ethical limits of medical science and resurrection and playing God. And that resonated with people because it's an idea that even today is often very terrifying. It's fascinating and terrifying at the same time, because we're not necessarily comfortable with the idea of pushing those boundaries. And so it's interesting that Frankenstein has become part of the zeitgeist. It is part of our collective unconscious. Every single time somebody pushes the boundaries of science, every time somebody pushes it too far, or creates something that we believe somehow violates the rules of nature, we tend to call them a Frankenstein. It's become the buzzword that refers to medical and sort of ethical hubris.
Yeah. Now I'm going to put that picture up there again. This was actually taken by Chris.
This was, yeah, that was in. I have to say, it was in it was in, I'm sorry, 2018. And I have to tell you, I feel ridiculous that I did not realize at the time that when I was in Germany, heading up to see Castle Frankenstein, I had no idea that it was the 200th anniversary of the publication of the novel. I wasn't in Germany to go to Castle Frankenstein. It was just a wonderful opportunity for a side trip, and I wish I'd realized at the time it was the 200th anniversary. But so yeah, 200 years after its initial publication. It was quite a trip. It was, as I say, it was an unexpected bonus of my trip to Germany.
Yeah. And Ron, would you say, and this is something that's pretty common to us now, and I don't know about box offices back then or anything like that, but is it accurate to say that Frankenstein was the first movie franchise, perhaps? And you know, because there were sort of a bastardization of it, of course. Everybody, you know, wanted to jump on that, and you know, they had numerous actors, and even in modern day, the Frankenstein mythology, the idea of reanimation or grave robbing, all of those elements, you know, still resonate with people today.
And Chris, you'll have to back me up on this, but I believe that Edison actually created a silent Frankenstein film. That was probably the first one. Is that correct?
I think it's, yeah, like around 1912 or something in that neighborhood, and it still
Really?
exists.
It
The
still
film
exists,
still
right?
exists. You can find it on YouTube. It's a fairly short film, and but it's a fascinating. It sort of veers more towards the idea that he uses magic
Right.
to animate the creature. But yeah, that's the first the first version, at least that we're aware of, unless there's some lost version out there of Frankenstein
Right.
committed to film.
And
And
that's very early on, though. Very early on in the filmmaking process.
it was, but you know, like with anything else, you know, even the images from that still resonate today. When you see it, you still can feel, even if you didn't know what you were watching, you
Right.
would catch on very quickly that it's the story of Frankenstein.
Right. And then to answer Ken's question, I think that it all does kind of play together, because now you have a character in which it can interact in different worlds. So yeah, there it is. Perfect.
There you
These
go.
are awesome. Yeah. So it's very appropriate too that the Wizard of Menlo Park, who was so fascinated with electricity, would happen to make this as well too. But we have the character now of the Frankenstein monster. And now we can do a whole bunch of things with him. And now we start introducing him to other archetypes like werewolves, like Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, and we have Frankenstein meets Dracula. So now we have him as part of this crossover on these kind of different mythos as well too. So I think that what you said is very correct. I think it becomes definitely one of the first horror franchises in history.
Yeah, and everybody borrows from it because even today, the idea of the large, hulking, indestructible beast, whether it's Frankenstein or Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees or whatever it is, there's something ominous and threatening and foreboding about that still exists today. Even on a local level, where you see these towns have whether it's the escaped lunatic or whatever it is, just that deep sense of foreboding about this character who seems to be impervious to pain or indestructible.
Right. Yeah, I think, without Frankenstein, you definitely would not have Michael Myers, and you definitely would not have Jason, because these characters are human, correct? I mean, they're flesh and blood.
That's the frightening part.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So when we talk about monsters, what we really are not focusing on is the true monster in the Frankenstein story is the scientist, where we get the name Frankenstein from, right? The Frankenstein monster, the monster's name's not Frankenstein. That is the scientist that put him all together. And that is the true monster. What he had done then was
Correct.
Unleashed something onto the world that was, like I said, better left buried.
It's actually interesting that's even more true than you might realize, because in the novel Frankenstein, it's rarely portrayed this way, although there have been more accurate adaptations later on. Is that in the novel Frankenstein, goes against all of his professors and all the advice of everyone who he confides in his plan to. Everyone tells him, that it's a bad idea to do this, but he goes through with it. He assembles, parts from stolen cadavers and stitches together this enormous man, and then has this great hubris to use science and galvanism to bring the creature to life. But as soon as he sees this enormous corpse-like thing, sort of sitting up in the lab, and realizes that he's done it, he's overwhelmed with horror and regret for what he's done, and he flees the lab and he abandons this newborn creature, to just completely abandons it, like abandoning a newborn baby. The creature, sort of wanders off into the wild every time it encounters other human beings. It's of course the response is fear and violence, because it's a repulsive creature, and so it learns that the world is a cruel and terrible place. And so as the creature grows, it becomes bitter and it becomes resentful. And so Frankenstein creates not just the creature, but he creates the monster that the creature becomes. The creature becomes evil, not because it was born evil, but rather because he was abandoned by his parents. So the monster in the story is absolutely Victor Frankenstein, who trying to do something good ends up, being, the disaster that creates the story. The monster itself is a very tragic figure.
Well, and that's what I was going to say next. You use the word hubris, and that is very appropriate, because we are looking at almost like a Greek tragedy here, correct? Victor Frankenstein was basically a good person who was trying to do something that nobody else had tried to do, but because he had this hubris and this idea that he would not be pulled from or shaken from, that leads to his ultimate downfall, and ultimately the downfall of anybody that comes in contact with the monster as well too. Because it is so telling, because it sheds so much light on the human condition, that is the reason why even today we see film versions of it or TV adaptations from it, because it still means something to us. The last big budget one was Kenneth Branagh and playing Victor Frankenstein, and Robert De Niro playing the monster. That was, probably about 20 some years ago. But keep in mind, we still have movies out like Van Helsing, where you have the monster and Dracula and the Wolfman all at the same time as well too. So we still see these creatures out there because we still need them. Because why do we need them so much? Is because we see our reflection in them, don't we? That's what means so much to us. Is we and I say this almost every time I do any kind of discussion whenever it comes to cryptids or the paranormal. We don't want to admit that we as humans are capable of doing so many heinous things. So we put the mask of monsters on them. But what happens in the figure of Frankenstein is that we strip this down to the bare bones. And when we look at the figure of Frankenstein, there's nothing else that we can see in that mirror than our reflection of what we've done.
There's a great line in the original, was it 1931, I believe, the original Universal film Frankenstein. There's a great line that no one ever hears. It's in the script. You can see, oh gosh, I wish I could remember the name of the actor now, who plays Victor, or actually Henry Frankenstein is what he's called in the film. But when he first creates the monster and the monster comes to life, he says the line, by God, now I know what it feels like to be God. And the line was considered so offensive and so scandalous that they superimposed a crash of lightning over it so you can't hear him say it. It was that shocking, even in 1931. And it's interesting, Ken, you said at the beginning talked about it being the first film franchise. It's interesting that today the Marvel superhero connected universe of films is considered to be such an unprecedented thing. And it is. It's an extraordinary juggernaut of filmmaking. But the Universal monster movies, not merely Frankenstein, but the Universal monster films of the 1930s and 1940s were the first true shared universe. No one had ever tried anything like that before. They had such success with Frankenstein and Dracula that they gave each of them sequels. But a couple of movies into it, they started combining characters. And as Ron mentioned a few minutes ago, Frankenstein meets the Wolfman was the first time they took two of their characters, put them together in a single film. That was tremendously successful. And so they tried it again, and they eventually worked their way through getting all the monsters together on screen in a shared continuity. And they would refer to events that had taken place in previous films and had the continuity wasn't fabulous, but it was an amazing shared universe of creatures, and actually ended up sort of fizzling out at the end with the movie Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which was the first time they'd actually tried to do comedy using the original classic Universal monsters. But it's a great piece of trivia that Bela Lugosi, who made his career playing Dracula in the original 1931 Dracula film, only played the role twice in his lifetime, and the first time and last time he came back to the role of Dracula was for Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. So those are the only two times he played the character.
Yeah, and if you look at this, and one of the things that people like of a certain age, like we are, I mean, whether it was Harold Ramis, Dan Aykroyd, they remember the Abbott and Costello, the combination of comedy, sort of whistling past the graveyard, comedy and horror, and then you went on to Ghost Breakers, which is one of my favorite movies of all time with Bob Hope. And they were of that age. They grew up on those things. So the combination of horror and comedy eventually came down to Ghostbusters. Probably, I don't know if it's the granddaddy of them all, but it sure is the most profitable. One of the things we'll turn to, and I'll bring George in a little bit, we're going to turn to the legend of vampires and vampirism. But I just wanted to circle back on the idea of myths, legends, and so forth as it pertains to contemporary times. For example, how much of this in your minds are just parables or cautionary tales where we like to talk about, moms like to talk about the monsters in the basement or the monsters in the woods, because it's a great way of scaring your child not wandering off and possibly doing themselves harm. So you tell them these stories and frighten the hell out of them, because that's what mothers will do. But if you look to universities, for example, every state has a college or a university that has a legend attached to it. There is either a psycho killer who's wandering the grounds back in the 60s when he may or may not have a hook for an arm or what have you. Or a couple is out parking one night and in the throes of romance, they hear scratching on the door. And how much of those are parables, cautionary tales? Something like that where, you know, if you're in the throes of passion, you know, the boogeyman will get you. Is that a parable for you shouldn't have casual sex? The madman on campus, is that a parable for don't go out by yourself? There's always a nun that had hung herself because she became pregnant by a priest. Every state and every university has something like that. A co-ed jumped out of a building. She was practicing the dark arts. You know, is that a parable for, hey, you shouldn't mess with those things? So rather than just, you know, slap somebody on the wrist, we create this horrific retribution that will come to you. So how much of that really is based on the idea that you're just telling people, no, no, no? Pretty effective.
I think there's an element of puritanical sort of morality in that, and the truth is that you're absolutely correct. Not only do most of these urban legends have at least an element of a sort of a cautionary tale, but it's certainly seeped in. You know, earlier you were talking about Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger, all these horrific monsters from modern cinema, these slasher characters who, in many ways, are descendants of Frankenstein and vampires and things like that. But it's been for years and years and years, it's almost become a joke that if you have sex in these films, you will absolutely be killed. It's usually the innocent virginal girl, the one who's good, the one who doesn't fool around, who ends up being the last one who survives. And this has been a pattern that's evolved in horror films. And so they do have a sort of a conservative bent, a very puritanical view that tells you that yes, you will come to a gruesome and sticky end if you basically if you let fly and let your morality down. So,
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you let your passions control your reason, this is what happens, right? It's very Shakespearean. If you allow yourself to kind of de-evolve, if you will, and let your passions and let your more bestial side run wild, that is going to be your comeuppance, right? That's what's going to be your ultimate flaw that's going to take you down.
And actually, you know, in exactly that, along exactly those lines, that most of the great monsters of cinema are animalistic in some way,
Sure.
whether it's werewolves or vampires, which have a directly animalistic connection to, you know, the Frankenstein monster, which is considered in most versions is portrayed as mute and monstrous. There is always a wildness there. It's the loss of humanity in these people and in these beings that makes them monstrous. And again, yeah, a cautionary tale that our humanity is the only thing that stands between us and doom, which is
Right.
interesting.
Yeah.
Because in Frankenstein, to snap back to that for a moment, it's the hubris is not about a loss of humanity. It's about believing that humanity is better than nature. And so you have a real conflict of concepts there where maybe sometimes our faith in our human superiority is more of a downfall than our, you know, than the animal kingdom that we seem to be afraid of.
Well, I get into this discussion often with demonologists, and I'll just touch on this real quick, unless you guys want to go there. I want to bring George in. But a lot of the writings or a lot of the things people espouse in terms of the demonic and even in our culture today, I'm not so sure they just didn't have their origins in literature. Not to be blasphemous or anything or judgmental, but when you look at John Milton, you look at Dante, we've taken so much of those writings. If you look in mythology, even in Norse mythology, the idea of hell was a person, not just a place. Hel. One side of her face was a female, absolutely stunningly gorgeous. The other side, hideous, which is representative of the duality of man. beauty and ugliness, good and bad, good and evil. And other cultures borrowed from that. The idea of hell, Hades, these are all based in Norse mythology or Greek mythology or sometimes Egyptian mythology. So stories are a wonderful thing. And when I get back here, we're going to talk about one of the other ones, but I'm going to bring George Lopez right now while I refresh my drink. Take it away, George.
Thank you.
I hope you got your sandwich, George.
Yeah, right. Oh, and I appreciate that, Ken. Thank you so much. Our guest tonight, Christopher Rondina and Ron Murphy, talking about lores and legends. But let's throw in a little bit of paranormal here too. And just to remind everybody that is in the chat, keep it in mind or Google it if you're not aware of your area there for lore that you're familiar with in your region of the country or of the world. We'll be putting up the number to call in right after our top of the hour break. But I want to go in this direction with both of you gentlemen as far as where you tie it into your experience as paranormal investigators. Obviously, as we talked about your visit to Dracula's castle and to Frankenstein's castle, Christopher, did you try and make contact? Did you run any type of investigation while you were there to see as to whether or not there was contact to be made? And we've seen that on some of the shows, including Ghost Hunters International, where they went there and, again, using English, using, again, trying to use some phrases in the native language there as well. But you wonder as to whether or not there is the possibility that there are spirits there of the residents of the location, and B, there are manifestations of the lore that have been created within those properties. Either of those something that you endeavor to experiment with and see if you can locate?
Well, in Romania, yes. It's interesting. The impetus to go to Romania and to go to visit Castle Dracula was because I had already been for many years at that point studying vampire folklore here in New England, which is my native area, and was writing a book on New England vampire folklore, but learned that a lot of New England vampire folklore probably did descend from Eastern European vampire folklore. And growing up fascinated with Dracula, I thought that I had to at least bring that perspective into it. And so ended up back in 1996 deciding to travel to Romania and explore the path of the historical figure who was one of the main inspirations for Dracula, and that being Vlad
Vlad
III
the
of Wallachia, yes, who was definitely known by his enemies as Vlad the Impaler. And I think Ron, you were saying earlier that Vlad the Impaler or Vlad Dracula is a fascinating character because in literature, of course, Dracula is generally portrayed as a monster, and in uh, later history, he was also portrayed in a very monstrous way. In fact, Vlad the Impaler, his nickname, he would never have used that, and nobody, in their right mind would have ever said it to his face, or they probably would have ended up on a stake.
Right.
He called himself Vlad Dracula, which meant son of the dragon, and this was because he, descending from his father, became a member of an order of Christian knights called the Order of the Dragon, the Ordo Dracul. And so Draculia was son of the dragon, and that was the name that he would have adopted, and that's how he signed official documents. But his brutality, it has two parts. The first is that it was a very, very grim age. He was trying to defend Romania. It wasn't called Romania at that time. It was Wallachia, Transylvania, Moldavia were the regions that he was best known, but he was trying to invade it from an Ottoman invasion and had to use these brutal tactics because he had smaller troops, he had less support, and he had to find ways that he could demoralize the invading Ottoman army. And so he used these very brutal tactics to do so. But the other aspect of his story is that, like with modern political discourse, he ended up being assassinated, and the victors wrote the story. And so the legend of Dracula, the historic Dracula, has mostly been colored by people who were his enemies. And so they would publish pamphlets suggesting that he did these gruesome things, that he, murdered children, that he ate, corpses, that he drank blood, surrounded by fields of impaled people. And all of this is hearsay. And in fact, very unlikely to be true. Because as Ron pointed out earlier, in today, even in Romania, they consider him to be something of a national hero, and with fairly good reason. He's sort of a modern or a later version of a King Arthur figure to them, and they've always believed that Dracula kept Europe from becoming part of the Ottoman Empire. It's absolutely true. It's been said, suggested, and is probably not a stretch to say that if Dracula had not driven back the Turkish invasion of the 15th century, that we might all be speaking Turkish today. It was a very, very different time, and the Turks were overrunning Europe, and the Dracula legend mostly arose out of that. But when I went to Romania, I followed the track of two different characters. One would be the historic Vlad Dracula, and the other were the locations from the novel Dracula, which don't necessarily overlap. And we went to the ruins of Ponari Fortress, which is in Wallachia, outside of a little town called Arafu, which was, of all of the places that Dracula reigned from, there we go, right up on that hilltop there, of all the places that it reigned from, this is the one that would be considered Castle Dracula. Dracula had this fortress rebuilt from the ground up to be his personal citadel. And this is where he would spend his time. And it's where he was right up until the Turks finally succeeded in chasing him down, and unfortunately leading to his death. So back in 1996, we climbed that mountainside and we camped out. We had to pitch a tent in the north tower of those castle ruins on Halloween night. There's my good friend Berta Daniels, who's a brilliant photographer. So we camped in the north tower and we spent Halloween night there in 1996.
Get out of here.
Yes, we most certainly did. We were the only people on that mountain all night long, other than a gigantic black crow or raven who perched on the parapet and yelled at us all night. So I do have to wonder if that was a sign of some kind. But I will say this: we did not wake up in the morning with fang marks on our throat, and as far as I know, I could still go out into the sun safely. And so it was a fairly uneventful, although very, very chilly evening. And I found myself believing that that probably in some way, if the ghost of Vlad Dracula exists anywhere, it's in that castle. That was the last. That was his last true home. That was the place where, according to legend and at least some historical truth to it, he lost his wife, who, believing that the Turks would do much worse to her, is said to have thrown herself from the parapet of the castle before the Turks arrived to save herself from what they would have done to her. Dracula himself fled the castle, was shortly tracked down, and is believed to have been assassinated by his own brother, Radu the Beautiful, he was known as, who ended up enthralled to the Turkish Sultan and becoming one of the Turks' generals. So it's a fascinating historical story, and elements of Vlad Dracula's story made their way into Bram Stoker's novel to become the story of the vampire Dracula. And there is interesting overlap between those two stories. The locations in the novel Dracula don't really directly intersect where any of the places where the historical Dracula lived, but there are elements of the real Dracula story that actually lend credence to the idea that he would have actually become a vampire. So it's a fascinating story.
It is indeed. And Ron, I want to reverse engineer the aspect of, with legends and lore, Bigfoot. And I guess there's a Y in front of this statement, but when you're talking about vampires, you're talking about wolfmen, you're talking about certain things that people aspire to be. You're talking about the people claim to have sightings or experiences with creatures of that legend and lore. And yet, when it comes to this 9-foot, what a coincidence, similar to what Frankenstein is, this creature, all hairy, what a coincidence to what Wolfman is, but has yet to be really deemed legend and lore. What separates the two? The amount of sightings or the contemporary aspect of it? But why have people not looked at a Bigfoot, that creature, that lore, as being legend lore, and more so still being something that is cryptid, something that is still a creature out there, and not been put into the same category. You follow where I'm saying with this?
I do, and the book that I had written about I guess it's about 6 years ago was on Wildman tracking Bigfoot through history, and I did look throughout the oh they're perfect. Wow, you guys are quick. So yeah, so what I see it as is something that is folkloric. I see it as something that's legendary, but your point is actually well taken because what happens whenever you see something and you experience something? You become part of a group that's separate from everybody else, correct? So if especially whenever you come you're involving with Bigfoot investigators, you cannot communicate with a legend. You cannot wood knock a legend. You could not try to leave offerings and things like that. It has to be necessarily still flesh and blood if we are going to keep on pursuing it, right? I mean
Vamp-
that's the way it's really come down. I do
People
spend time.
offer up themselves for vampires, though,
Yeah,
don't they?
well, that's something that we can definitely talk about as well too, because right now, if you wanted to, you could probably go to some place up in Boston. I know New York City has one. You can go to yourself to a vampire bar. Absolutely.
Yes.
If you want to find if somebody to suck your blood, you suck somebody's blood, you could definitely find that. And there's a lot of people out there that identify themselves as vampires.
Yes.
But the idea of Bigfoot is almost like a club mentality. I've seen it, you haven't, kind of a thing. It's something to bring people together. If
True.
we are going to get to the bottom of all these mysteries, if we are going to be left at the end of the day with maybe something a little bit more than just a question mark, we have to look at this stuff from a multidisciplinary perspective. We have to, because it's not making any sense that if we see something out there where people are reporting this thing constantly, within eyeshot of a Walmart, and it's still not been categorized by science, there's something more that's going on out there. Now, I've spoken to people, I've spoken to a lot of people, I've interviewed a lot of people who I believe that they had some sort of experience with what we would call Bigfoot. And I have been in the woods and have had anecdotal things happen to me as well too. But we have to also look at the origin of where Bigfoot arises from. And whenever we look at the Native American cultures, we see the Bigfoot as not only something that's completely tangible, but we see it as something that straddles two worlds at one time. We see it as also a very spiritual creature as well too, and we have eliminated that from our idea of what Bigfoot is now, right? He's become a Harry and Henderson's to us now. He's become something that we can sell pizza with. He's become he's become a spokesperson. He's become a commodity,
Nothing unlike what happened with Frankenstein and Wolfman with Abbott and Costello.
We have come full circle, my friend. You see how that works? Absolutely. Yeah. We've come full circle. So we've come from an idea, probably some sort of kernel of truth within these legends and folklores, because we're going back thousands of years, not only in North America, but we can travel around the world and see that almost all cultures around the world, even Australian cultures, have the notion of the wild man within it. Levi Strauss has this whole idea of structuralism, that the human mind likes to think in binary terms, that if you have good, you have to have bad. If you have something that's civilized, you have to have the uncivilized. And that fits into that schema very nicely. But schemas also aren't leaving tracks in your backyard and not howling at night and not being photographed. So there is something else going on there as well too. But as an investigator, as investigators, we have to look at all aspects of what we call this creature. And no matter what we're looking at, we have to look at all aspects, because we're never going to get a true picture if we just look at it one dimensionally.
Gentlemen, and we're coming up on the break here, but let me ask you both your perspective on this question. We talk about reanimation of humans, with the Frankenstein probably being one of the biggest origins. as far as film was concerned, it was about the 1960s, I want to say, when Night of the Living Dead came about. And is that an adaptation? Is that a reinterpretation of this reanimation of a dead body coming back to life? In perspective, it is, but is it another variation of a theme
I
with
think
regards to Frankenstein?
I think it comes from a different place. I think that the fears evoked in the sort of zombie phenomena, which has certainly become a huge cultural phenomena in the
Massive.
last, couple decades. I think that does come from a different place, because the story of Frankenstein and the cautionary tale is less about the living dead than it is, again, as we've explored, about the dangers of tampering with sort of, I guess, what you would consider to be God's laws, and breaking God's laws, trying to become God, etc. And so it is a very cautionary tale. I think that the zombie phenomena comes from a couple of different places, but it actually encapsulates a couple different ideas. One, I believe it was in the movie Dawn of the Dead, which was early 1970s, if I'm not mistaken, which was, unofficially speaking, still directed by George Romero, a sequel to Night of the Living Dead. And one of the characters in the film says that his grandmother told him that when no more people could fit in hell, that the dead would walk the earth, or when hell was full, the dead
Yes.
would walk the earth. And I think that it, number one, it taps into our religious fears, our ideas of sort of hell rising up to claim us. So I think that it taps into not just religious fears and religious paranoia, but the other element of specifically the movie Dawn of the Dead, which, again, it's a very different film from Night of the Living Dead. Night of the Living Dead is just strictly a horror film, where Dawn of the Dead, its follow-up, was also something of a social satire, because that film takes place in a mall. And
Yeah.
one of the fascinating things, and the really sharp social satire that exists within that film, is that the reason that this mall is overrun by the dead is that they are still driven by that base, almost animalistic commercial need. And so these risen dead figures no longer have their humanity, but all that's left of them is this will to just complete the that sort of commercial, that consumer need. Literally, consuming is the only thing that they know. So they're not just eating people,
Right.
they're sort of bashing themselves against the gates of closed stores, because that's what they knew in life.
Right.
And as a cautionary tale, it's a little more on the nose than I think we all want to admit, because let's be honest, on any given Black Friday, we watch the Dawn of the Dead happen again. When you see it.
Every single
I'm not
year.
even trying to be funny about that. I mean, it's horrifying to think that we are so conditioned, by this 21st century, consumer-driven world, that we are willing to put ourselves in mortal danger to get a
Right.
cheap television. That's terrifying. And I
It
think
is.
that is what the zombie phenomena speaks to, much more than the sort of hubristic morality tale of Frankenstein.
We got to take a break real quick. I want to keep on this topic on the other side. I want to hear what Ronald has to say, but let's get to that break real quick. I know we're behind the clock here, so we'll take that. We'll be right back with Ron Murphy and Christopher Rondina. Stay with us, guys.
Who is it? How'd you get this number?
Hey, Ken. Hey, man, it's George. Hey, man, what are you doing?
Right now, I'm trying to chop ice off of my deck here before somebody breaks their neck. What are you doing today?
Me? Oh, you know, ghost hunting. Hey, listen, Bill from KGRA wants us to do a commercial, a promo for the show for them to play. Got any ideas?
I don't know, man. I don't know if I want to film a commercial or something like that. Well, hey, why don't we just do a montage or something, like clips from the show, and just call it a day?
Okay, yeah. Just put a bunch of highlighted parts of the show. Not a problem. I'll take care of that. Listen, have a great day. I'm almost done here.
Yeah, all right, man. Let me know how you make out, all right? Yeah, you bet. Be good. Oh. I'm okay.
Tony, I love you.
I love you too. Yeah, you know what? That's why I hate when they say the old people in the Northeast are so rude. I'm like, you, I'm down here and I'm being nice, and everybody's like, you know, not even a wave. I'm like, you're not going to get the coronavirus from waving at somebody.
A little close up to you. Check this out. Hello.
Hang on, let's get us on camera again so we can wave. Wave back, Robert.
Yeah.
If you wait.
Robert, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing some time, inviting us into your home.
I co-authored a book with Andrea Perrin, if anybody was not aware of that.
No one is aware of that.
No, and I've never been to the Conjuring House.
Yeah. I wrote a book
We're going to do this again.
With Andrea Perrin, and I've still never been to the farmhouse. Did I mention I wrote a book with Andrea? I wanted to, it's over my shoulder there, and I've never been.
We took a 2-week absence from this, and now we're back with
to the Conjuring House.
Dude, I'm hiding, man. It's COVID. Oh, I'm sorry. It's
What's going on?
I love that blanket. I'm having blanket envy.
I know you are right now, right?
Yes.
Sometimes I move it around with my body. It's like Ouija meets Twister. In the middle of the night, I contact spirits just by rolling around on it naked.
Watch Dead Air on KGRADB.com Sundays from 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific.
And also, don't forget to check out KGRA YouTube and KGRA on Facebook for all the amazing shows, guests, and topics. Did I mention that I wrote a book with Andrea Perrin?
In honor of 2/22, KGRA Digital Broadcasting is showing you double the love with a couple of new ways to enjoy the benefits of membership. Use promo code FEB22 to activate a 20% discount on your annual membership and receive a free 30-day trial. You will enjoy 24-hour access to your favorite hosts, engaging you on incredible topics. This includes all episodes in our members-only portals. Then imagine access to our award-winning classic episodes in the members-only KGRA DB Vault and gain access to KGRA DB special content and programming. Go to KGRADB.com and type promo code FEB22. That's FEB22.
Just like the man said, KGRADB.com. And again, enter in that code FEB22 for a 30% discount. And you want to check out all the amazing shows that they have on there. Ken, hit my music. Welcome back, everybody. The second hour of our show tonight with a very special guest, Christopher Rondina and Ron Murphy. talking legends and lore. And I want to thank you guys again for being with us tonight. And love and light to all of you who have joined us tonight. Let us light our candles in harmony with regards to the paranormal and who we are. Thank you so. Oh, it's giving me a headache. Stop. Okay. We're going to have to look through that music list and see what's going on from there. Chris, Rondina, Ronald Murphy, welcome back, gentlemen. Again, thank you for taking the time out on your Sunday schedule to be with us tonight. Always appreciate it, definitely.
It's an honor to be here, gentlemen. I'm flattered that you asked me to come on.
I would like both of you to very, very quickly, before we continue on with the show and topics, to give everybody some of your information. First and foremost, obviously, who you are, what it is that you do within this paranormal field, and any contact information and anything promotionally that you guys would like to put up. We'd love to hear from you at this time. We'll start with you, Ronald. Go ahead.
All right. So, So I write about the paranormal on the aspect of the archetype and how these creatures have evolved over the centuries and over the millennia until they become what we have today. I have written probably about 21 books on the various aspects of the paranormal, from ghosts and vampires and werewolves up to some of my research that I've done in my particular area of Western Pennsylvania. I have an undergraduate degree in literature, and I have a master's degree in history. So I like to look at the paranormal world through a multidisciplinary perspective, like I said a little earlier. I like to travel to these places as well too. I wish I had traveled as much as Christopher did. I've got to look throughout most of the United States and into Canada for things like I had to visit all the Great Lakes whenever I was writing my aquatic lake monster book. But I've also been to places like Loch Ness and Whitby in the search of track down the Dracula legend there as well too. I think it's important to go to these places. I hope Christopher expounds on this a little bit as well too. When you go to these places, it does kind of flesh out I see your things on Sleepy Hollow behind you as well too, and I've been to Sleepy Hollow, so hopefully talk about that as well too.
Oh boy!
Yeah,
will we?
Yeah, what you had said before, Ken, whenever you asked people to send in stories about their local ghosts and things, you're absolutely right. Every place has these legends attached to it. And whenever you go to these places, it's you can feel it. You know what I mean? It's electricity in the air, especially if they devote a cottage industry around it, like places like Whitby has done or Loch Ness has done. But yeah, it's tangible. It's everywhere. It permeates everything. I'm just a guy that has a lot of questions. I've been interested in the paranormal since I've been a child, and I just am trying to get some answers for myself. And then anything that I find out, I like to spread it around to other people too and write a book about it.
Fantastic. Mr. Rondina.
It's coincidental that you would mention Whitby. I have not yet been to Whitby. I'm going there in April, actually, going there to sort of cap off research for my next book, which is called Hunting Dracula, and it's going to sort of chronicle my 30-year search for the truth behind both the legend and the historical aspects of Dracula. But I am an author and legend hunter. I'm more of a storyteller than an academic, but I've spent the last 30 years or so largely hunting down legendary creatures, from werewolves, vampires, the Frankenstein monster, and of course the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow, one of my favorite subjects. But you can find my current books that are in print: Ghosts of New England, Legends of Sleepy Hollow, and then the forthcoming Hunting Dracula on my website, ghostboypress.com. And I've got a couple of other books that I'll be reissuing very soon, including Ghost Ships of New England. So I've written over the years 7 books. A couple of them are out of print right now and may eventually resurface, but Dracula is my target right now. I'm sort of, as I say, capping off a very, very long process of researching this book with a trip to Whitby on the coast of England, which, if you are familiar with the novel Dracula, is where Dracula arrives when he comes to the New World. So I'm very excited about that, and hopefully you folks will check it out. Pre-orders are available currently on ghostboypress.com.
Nice.
Very nice.
So, what got you interested? If I could ask a question, if I could talk out of turn here for a second.
Go,
As far as I go, Bigfoot was the thing for me growing up. It was one of those things in the 70s. It was being cited everywhere. So what got you involved in the Dracula legend? Like, was it a movie that you had seen, or what happened?
I'm not 100% sure I can pinpoint a very specific thing, but I can tell you that when I was about 6 years old, I had the very great fortune to live in a rural area, and I had a large wildlife sanctuary bordering my family's property. And so I would go up to their nature center and spend time with the animals, and they would occasionally get in injured bats. And I was beyond fascinated by bats. I thought they were just most extraordinary creatures. And to this day, I'm a huge bat conservationist and a huge fan of them. I think they're one of the most remarkable creatures in the world. And I think because of my fascination with bats, every time the image of Dracula would show up anywhere from a TV screen under a box of Count Chocula, the connection to bats was always there. And so I think I formed that connection very early on. And also as a kid, those very same wildlife preserves called the Norman Bird Sanctuary would often host Halloween parties for the neighborhood kids. And they would get, and this is really dating myself, they would get the old 8mm silent cut down versions of the old Universal horror movies. So I got to watch Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, Son of Dracula, and all of these different movies in these little capsulated forms. And I fell in love with these monsters. And so I grew up absolutely loving them. But that always had a little bit of a backseat until I was a teenager. And as a teenager, I started hearing bits and pieces of the local vampire legends that were part of my New England upbringing. And my home state of Rhode Island has this amazing vampire folklore that is one of the most unique outside of Eastern Europe. And so over the years, I collected bits and pieces, clippings from newspapers about these local vampire stories that dated back to the 1700s. And my very first book was called Vampire Legends of Rhode Island and detailed some of that history. And that is what ended up, as I mentioned at the beginning, that ended up sending me on my journey to Transylvania to sort of cap off that research. And so Dracula's always been there for me. He's always been in the background, but obviously making the decision to go to Transylvania and sort of explore the historic Dracula's connections really made it blossom. And so it's become kind of a life pursuit.
Yeah. I like the idea that what you said about there's a love for it, because that is the thing, gentlemen. Even though we're talking about things that are very scary to us, things that are, that go bump in the night, things that are that nightmares are made of, there's still that love for it as well, too, right? Because we're so intrinsically tied in with these things that the more familiar you become with them, not only do you become more frightened by them, but you also fall even deeper in love with them as well, too, which is one of those really strange dichotomies whenever it comes to investigating the paranormal.
Fear is an incredibly powerful emotion, and it's one of the only emotions that we have that's still very primal. We don't experience many primal emotions anymore. We live in such a safe, really since the dawn of civilization, when we started living in houses and not out in the wild. Fear has become one of the only strong emotions that we really still have immediate access to, and that frisson, that incredible passion that fear evokes, let's face it, as human beings, for some reason, we do pursue extreme experiences. And it's one of the few that you can have. And so I think that's why fear is so intoxicating to us. It's the reason why roller coasters, haunted houses, and scary movies are so attractive to us, is because fear creates that incredible, powerful emotional force, and it makes us feel alive. And so it's no surprise to me that that we pursue what seems like, it seems crazy to think about it, but we pursue the experience of fear.
And isn't it strange? And I want to get back to the question I had just before the break, and I know Ken wants to get into Sleepy Hollow, but I wanted to readdress this because I know, Ron, you didn't get a chance to answer either, but in just listening to you gentlemen in these last few minutes also makes me think about the I guess the organic changes with regards to the Walking Dead. Here again, starting off no different than Frankenstein, Dracula, and even getting into Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees, very slow walking creatures, and then the adaptation of faster moving Living Dead. But isn't it funny though, within the last 20 years or so, how it's more from something that is theological, again, the rising from the dead, end of days, to man-made creations of these things, chemicals. Even when we heard about what happened in Miami with the bath salts and the guy eating the other guy's face off, that it became much more realistic in the mind's eye that we could, and especially with the last 2 years going on with the coronavirus, that we could in fact create what we fantasize in life imitating art. Again, do you notice again, and Ron, I know you didn't get a chance to answer in the other half, that there are a lot of comparisons here that we have possibilities of creating our own horrors.
Sure, absolutely. That's all right. So I am lucky enough that I live in Western Pennsylvania, where not very far from where Night of the Living Dead was filmed. And actually my hometown where I grew up in was actually listed as one of the places on the film itself, on the bottom line, about where I could go to escape the zombie apocalypse that was happening. So what George Romero did with that movie is he made it so lifelike. It was like you were watching people watching it on television. So we were all kind of caught up in that itself. Now we have to remember, again, he did not create this out of a vacuum. He drew upon other legends and everything, especially when we look at the vampire, in Eastern Europe, we have the Revenant, this kind of creature that is a reanimated corpse that would go out and not necessarily prey upon anybody, but it was a reanimated corpse. But I think that what we see, and like Christopher had said, what we see in the creation of new age monsters, if you will, 21st century monsters, is that they are straddling different lines now. There are commentaries to be had there. There is definitely the consumers, and there's a line in the book, The Walking Dead. I don't know if it was ever on the televised series or not. But somebody came out with a very pertinent line and said that we are the Walking Dead. The living are the Walking Dead. And it kind of comes the whole way around at that point. Because, if we just go through life with, blinders on, that's what happens. What I think, this is my prediction, because whenever we saw what would happen if a virus escaped, then we have like 28 days later and these fast moving zombies,
Yes.
What I think now, whenever we have, things like the coronavirus and so many conspiracy theories going into how this was created, I think that what we are going to see in the future, and probably the very near future, is our movie monsters are going to become much more human. They're not going to be so much of things that are brought here from outer space or come out of the depths of the earth. These are going to be much more human monsters, because that's what's fearing us right now.
Without question.
Ron, you make an excellent point there, and I actually think, though, is that it's already happened. In fact, it's an ongoing process, because if you made a really good point with the Revenant. Old folklore vampires, go back a few hundred years, vampires were not sexy. They were not aristocratic. They were not seductive in any way. Vampires were monstrous corpse-like creatures that dug their way out of the grave and attacked the living. And no one would ever choose no one would ever choose to become a vampire, because being a vampire was horrific. Now here, of course, we have a photo of Luke Evans from the film Dracula Untold, which is actually taking the concept of Dracula and not simply humanizing him, but actually placing him in a heroic context. And we've done more than simply humanize our monsters. We have an entire subgenre that has sprung up where we have made our monsters the protagonists of
romanticize
them.
At
the very least, he's not sparkly. So
and that's we can all thank God for that. But I think we have humanized our monsters for a lot of different reasons. I think one of them is because the monster inside, the monster next door, is a much more terrifying concept to us than the sort of the monster that's more distant. A monster that's hidden in the woods, all we have to do is not go into the woods. But when the monster is the guy who lives next door and he's not a monster until he reveals himself, that's a much more terrifying concept because it reflects our reality. When we live in a world of serial killers and terrorists and all the kind of things that we fear, even if sometimes just the person next door has a different political viewpoint, and so we think of them in a monstrous way. So humanizing our monsters allows us to connect with them and keeps the fear relevant. And I think that's one of the reasons why that's a constantly changing and ongoing process.
Not to prolong, because we have to get to these phone calls and other topics too, but interesting to follow that up, that there is, again, a romanticism in almost every single one of those, especially once it became motion pictures. Dracula always got the hot chicks, the way that it was always set up. And of course, the female vampires were hot chicks. The way it was always going that way.
Yeah.
But then Chris, you mentioned serial killers, and how many serial killers who did not get the death penalty, even if they did, got love letters.
Oh, yeah.
It's actually metaphorical in that it's metaphorical in terms of the act of sex, because there is a penetration involved.
Richard Ramirez.
Whether it's biting in the neck or,
Right. So whenever, so this is a great way to look at it. And again, this could be a whole show in and of itself, because I think, this is so.
It could be extremely strange.
Right. So whatever the Beatles sang, I want to hold your hand, they were not singing about wanting to hold a girl's hand, right? This is all euphemisms, right? And the same way with the biting on the neck was a euphemism for what could happen with, again, we talked about, this is going back to the campers in the woods again, isn't it? This is what happens whenever you let the wrong one in. And then there's this sexual kind of innuendo going on. Although even before Bram Stoker wrote his Dracula, we have what Le Fanu, is that how you pronounce it? He wrote
Carmilla.
Exactly, the female vampire, where there was this sexual tension between two women.
There's more overt sexuality in Carmilla than there ever was in Dracula.
Absolutely.
People, I think today, of course, because it's such an old book, I think a lot of people don't read the original novel Dracula or Frankenstein. I think most people know them from the cinematic interpretations, which almost always add an element of sexuality. But in Dracula, there's no romance in Dracula whatsoever. Dracula is not a romantic figure. He's never portrayed as attractive. He's a revolting figure, and his conquest of women is certainly analogous to rape, and that's really the whole of the story. There's no sub romance in that story whatsoever. But Carmilla was very different. Carmilla was incredibly seductive. In fact, Laura, I believe, is the name of Carmilla's victim in the story, the young girl who takes Carmilla in. Her family takes Carmilla in, believing that she's just a woman, in poor circumstances. She seduces Laura, and then they basically have to drag Laura away from this vampire who is killing her, because despite the fact that she's fading away into nothing as this vampire feeds on her, it's Stockholm syndrome. She's completely enraptured and enamored of this vampire. And so that sexuality has certainly existed in Gothic fiction. Even if Dracula really doesn't have it, it's certainly a major part of Gothic fiction and always has been, and kind of gets to the root of that idea. Maybe we should come back for Valentine's Day with our Sex and Monsters episode.
Well, two movies, and we're going to move on with a call here before we, but two movies that kind of got it right, really, the original Nosferatu, and I would make an argument for Salem's Lot, Stephen King, in terms of the depiction of the vampire. But before we move on to the next thing I want to get into, we do have a caller. Ronald in Minnesota is on. Ronald, you are on Dead Air with Christopher Rondina and Ronald Murphy. How are you tonight?
Hey, how you doing? And the Ronalds are taking over, so.
I didn't hear that.
We got it from here.
The Ronalds are taking over. Hey, I've got some Ron in my name too, so we got three.
That's right.
There you go. We're gonna take over, and everybody's gonna have to listen to what we want to tell them.
Over my dead body. But you go ahead with your question, Ronald.
All right, so I have three characters or cryptoids. That the latest or the one that was in the news, actually, a case was open, and the teenagers that was involved got sent to the mental institution basically for life because they ended up killing somebody out of fear of this character, which is called the Slender Man. Okay.
Have you watched Extremely Strange, our new show on the Dead Air YouTube channel, Ronald?
I need to.
You need to, because the initial episode that I had produced was about that particular case. So check that out.
Oh wow. Okay,
but
cool.
but thanks for the boost there, bud.
All right, you're welcome. You're welcome. And then the other two that I can think of is, of course, we had the I-35 collapse, I-35 bridge collapse. Okay, the one that runs between Wisconsin and St. Paul, you know. And so anyway, that collapsed in 2007, and apparently somebody had spotted a Mothman at the time of the collapse. Okay, so somebody created or constructed a Mothman figure. The thing is huge. And what's interesting about that is the Supernatural brothers, you know, Sam and Dean, they actually came to Wyndham in search of the Wendigo, but I think they were also looking for the Mothman thing too. But they were looking for the Wendigo character, which is the third one that I wanted to talk about, which the Wendigo, as I was looking up the information on that, they stand about 7 to 10 feet tall, and you can't see them sideways when they're sideways. You can only see them when they're facing you. Basically, when they're facing you, you're dead. Okay, so you don't want to be messing with that creature out there in the north.
Yeah, they fall into that category spiritually of shapeshifters and creatures that can become other animals
and that's interesting too, Ron. You've covered three very, very different types of myths there as well, because you have the Slender Man, which we already know is specifically an internet created fictional character that has taken on a life of its own. So that's a very, very specific type of
It was actually, if I could, Chris, it was actually designed for others to expound on
it's designed to be viral.
On its existence. You know, I think I mentioned in that particular thing that someone had created a backstory that it had its origins in Germany and so forth, but it was meant to just throw a grain of a story out there and just let everybody else.
And then your second character, the Mothman, is a character that that has at least some roots and is traceable in a folkloric way. At least it has a connection to much more ancient ideas, but as a cryptid figure is still a comparatively modern, sort of late 19th and early 20th century creation. And then finally you've got the Wendigo, which is an almost purely mythical and legendary creature, which has very, very deep roots. And so you've identified the three phases of sort of the urban and legendary creature. I don't know what you want to, the progression. So you've got the urban myth, you have the folkloric character, and then you have the one that's truly mythic. And that's fascinating
I think what it is, it's interesting that the delivery system is different, where you had word of mouth as opposed to the delivery system now, which is social media and the internet. But each one of those things, it's taken the place of, Mary Shelley has now become Reddit. In many ways,
Yep, absolutely. And because so many people, because so many people want to get out there, they're going to YouTube and everything else. Things can be faked now, like have never been able to be faked before. So people are putting these things out there, especially whenever you talked about the Slender Man. There were people actually recreating woodcuts from Germany with the Slender Man included in there to look like there was a provenance to this legend, when there was nothing to it at all.
Right, exactly.
Wow, that's cool. All right, well, thank you for a great show, and we'll talk to you guys next time.
Thanks for calling in.
Yep.
All right, Ron, thank you much, buddy. wanted to go somewhere before we started hitting into Sleepy Hollow, which it may or may not be perhaps the most iconic of all legend and folklore, with that grain of truth at the middle. But I wanted to circle back again in terms of legends and the paranormal and how they inform the paranormal. To give you an example, there are two that I will go, and when I talk about these things, I will bring these two up in particular. Two very iconic places. One is the Winchester Mystery House.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't need to hear the whole story, but Sarah Winchester, the heir to the Winchester rifle fortune, and spirits of those killed by the rifle came back. She was informed by a psychic, I believe, from Boston, that she would have to keep building on this essentially very small home in San Jose to confuse them, so forth and so on. And that's the story. But there is evidence that suggests that she was a follower of Sir Francis Bacon, who had a predilection of the number 13. And if you look at the Winchester Mystery House, the number 13 is very prevalent in terms of how many windows, how many pieces of stained glass are on a window, how many stairs there are, how many tiles are laid. So the legend really, though, has informed this place as someplace that's haunted, and it's an appointment for people to visit this, and that's their story. The other one I point to is Myrtle's Plantation, the legend of Chloe, who probably did not exist and never did, because census were around at the time, and everyone who was living in the house, whether they were a domestic, whether they were a slave, or part of the family, had to be accounted for. Nowhere in St. Francisville, Louisiana, in all their records, is there a Chloe, but yet this story has become accepted. This is what happens there. Now, I am not suggesting that either of these places aren't haunted and that people have experiences there. I'm not discounting those. But sometimes legends, and this is what I want you guys to talk about, sometimes these legends inform the paranormal and they become a magnet for people to go there, and essentially what they're looking for may be based on a false premise. And again, this is not to say somebody didn't have an experience at Myrtle's Plantation, but it may not be exactly what they think it is. And of course, you know, people profit by these things, and that's part of it. So before we get into Sleepy Hollow a little bit, I just wanted your perspective on those type of things. I picked two. You pick your own, because there are literally tens of thousands of these things out there.
Well, I think one of them is very close to your home, the Lizzie Borden house, correct? Is that like right across the street from where you're
That's
at?
actually, I could hit a 7-iron
Yes.
and knock it off
Yes.
the roof.
Yeah, but don't you think that has become one of these kind of meccas now for the paranormal, even though she was acquitted? You know, it still has that legendary feel that she was a female serial killer that killed her parents. You know, we still have that idea there, and people are still drawn there because of this tabloid fascination with what they assumed happened in that house, even though after all the court records show that she was, you know, found at least not guilty, at least provable in the course of law.
Yeah, I mean, and Christopher and I have been to her subsequent home, Maplecroft.
Both homes.
That
Yeah, both
we
homes.
found was probably more active, or at least raised enough questions in our mind on the nights we were there. And Christopher joined us on one of those nights, so he can attest to that there was some really bizarre things going on there. So again, it's not a question of, no, I don't believe you, I don't think it's haunted. I just think sometimes the directions that we're steered in don't necessarily match up with the realities of it. And, you know, I always find those kind of things fascinating to me, not because I'm trying to poke holes in anybody's stories, but, you know, I just like to take it out and give it a road test.
Sure.
You know,
we have a hunger, a true almost insatiable hunger to believe in something. And we live in a world where religion is certainly no longer a dominant factor in many people's lives. I think maybe because we live in the age of internet, and you can get on a plane, be halfway across the world in moments, is that because of that, science and technology have become a new religion for us. But we still want desperately to believe in something. UFOs, cryptids, and the paranormal are all in the realm of the unknown. And if we can convince ourselves, and I'm also not saying these things aren't real, but
Sure.
if we can convince ourselves that the unknown is out there, that there really is something beneath the surfaces of perception, then life retains its wonder, it retains its fascination. Not only that, but the truth is that the great question that has plagued mankind since the beginning of recorded history is this all there is? When we die, we want to know if there's something more beyond it. And that informs so much of our desire to believe in the paranormal. And so, whether or not any kind of paranormal phenomena exists, and again, I'm not even putting in an opinion on that right now, but whether or not it exists, our desire to bring meaning into our lives by believing in the paranormal informs a great deal of the way we respond to these things. And so when you have a place like the Myrtles Plantation, when you have a place like Lizzie Borden's house, or let's take for a great example the Amityville house.
Oh Lord.
All of the facts in the world will not dissuade a person once they have invested a degree of personal belief in it. Now, again, this doesn't say that any of these stories are real or not real or what have you. They're haunted or not. It just says that it doesn't matter if they're actually haunted. You're still going to find the haunting there if you are invested in finding that haunting.
Yeah,
And that's very tough for the paranormal community as a science, because we don't often behave as if we're a science. We behave as if we're a religion. And that can be very, very difficult. I think it's one of the reasons that we struggle with legitimacy.
Yeah. Well, every religion has a dogma.
Yes.
Which is something that is built on shaky ground to begin with in the paranormal, to me. I mean, I've had my own questions. We all do. And you and I, Chris, will talk because I think I know the answer to, is there something more beyond this? And I believe there is. And we'll have a conversation and I'll tell you exactly why. All right, so before we get out of here, I do want to get into Sleepy Hollow, which is one of the most beloved, iconic legends. When you have a legend that becomes a cartoon, okay, to my knowledge, not many Dracula cartoons, a few Frankenstein cartoons, but the Sleepy Hollow legend.
When Bing Crosby sings your story, you've made it.
Yeah. I read somewhere, and you can fill in the numbers, that the Legend of Sleepy Hollow is the most adapted piece of literature in history. And I'm just talking about different books, movies, animated films. It's been the most adapted in our history. So, Chris, you have had a very, very close tie to this because of your own interest. And Ron, it's a pleasure to hear that you have been there. So, Chris, I'm going to turn this over to you, and you can tell us a little bit about your experience there, what you've done, and the purpose for your research into this.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, just to quickly address what you said a moment ago, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is absolutely one of the most adapted. I'm not sure if I don't have numbers, so I can't necessarily measure it up against anything.
I believe I read that somewhere.
And it's entirely possible.
Right.
I will say that in terms of film adaptations, whether that's cartoon, animated, live action, etc., I know that it's not the most animated film property by any means. I think that although I think that Dracula and Frankenstein definitely get very close in those ways, but also book adaptations. It's never been out of print, as far as I know, in the 200 plus years that it's been in print, which is remarkable. But I have an absolute, almost all of my monster fascination, as we were discussing earlier, goes back to my childhood. And I think the first time I ever really remember encountering the Legend of Sleepy Hollow was the Disney cartoon. I was probably 7 or 8 years old back in the mid 1970s, and Disney's Halloween night special ran that climactic final chase between Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman from the Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and it was the best thing I'd ever seen. It was spooky and it was cool, and the image of the Headless Horseman rearing up with his flaming pumpkin was just magnificent. And so I became fascinated with the story then. Didn't read the original story by Washington Irving until many years later, because at 7, I'm not going to read a 200-year-old guy's travelogue. But when I finally came to read it many years later, fell in love with it all over again. So it's the first great American ghost story. At that time, America was a very, very new country. Hey, there we go. We could just watch the cartoon and I'd be perfectly happy. But we were a very new country. Washington Irving was born the year the American Revolution ended. And in 1819, when he was writing The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, this new country hadn't really found its own folklore yet. It hadn't found its own identity. And Washington Irving defined that identity. Washington Irving gave New York City the nickname Gotham, which, by the way, yes, gave us Gotham City from Batman. He gave us there's a great picture of the old Dutch church, which the Disney film adapted from the real location. He gave us the modern version of Santa Claus that we know. There's so many things that Washington Irving, as one of the first great American writers, brought to us.
Knickerbocker?
Yes. Now the Legend of Sleepy Hollow was the first truly great American ghost story. It is the most iconic ghost story in American history, and for years and years, I had wanted to publish an edition of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow that included footnotes for a lot of the history that went into the writing of the story. And so when I realized that 2019 was going to be the 200th anniversary of the writing of the book, or the writing of the story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, I decided that was a great time to publish my version. So I published a book called Legends of Sleepy Hollow. But in doing the research for it, I stumbled across a reference to an actual headless Hessian soldier. In the book, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, or the story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, he refers to the Headless Horseman as the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been taken off by a cannonball in some nameless battle of the American Revolution. And as it turns out, Washington Irving, like so many other writers, like Bram Stoker, like Mary Shelley, didn't invent his monster. He adapted his monster from something that existed in history, a local legend of a headless Hessian soldier who was still supposed to wander the Hudson River Valley. And so I found historical references to this headless Hessian from an 18th century journal belonging to a guy named Major William Heath, who was one of Washington's second in command during the Revolution, who actually was there and witnessed the beheading of this Hessian soldier by a cannonball. And I thought, how fascinating. I just need this Hessian soldier's name because I want to include this story in the book. But it turns out that nobody ever had discovered who the soldier was. The records existed. It was one of Washington's generals. We knew it wasn't apocryphal. It was clearly a true story, but nobody had ever identified the soldier. And so, being the lunatic that I am, I decided to try and track him down. And so actually one of Rise Up Paranormal's members, a fantastic historian by the name of Chris Blanchett, got me some leads in terms of German military records. But unfortunately, it turned out that the only complete version of those records existed in Germany. And that was how I ended up flying to Marburg, Germany in 2018 on the hunt for the origin of the Headless Horseman, which is coincidentally how I ended up being there to visit Castle Frankenstein. I mentioned, I think, at the beginning, that wasn't why I was there. I was there to track down the Headless Horseman. So I got 2 monsters for the price of 1. That's a bargain.
Right. Matinee.
Yeah, exactly. So I did. I was incredibly fortunate, and I actually tracked down the records of this young Hessian soldier, 24-year-old soldier from a town called Melsung in Germany, who was killed at the Battle of White Plains. Actually killed on November 1st, All Hallows Day, the morning after Halloween, and who actually gave rise to the legend of the Headless Horseman. So it was quite an exciting adventure, and that
is gorgeous.
remains one of my proudest accomplishments.
Look at that. That's beautiful.
That is right across the street from the cemetery where the Headless Horseman is supposed to tether his horse at night. That is Philipsburg Manor. It's beautiful. There's the original cemetery, and the original Dutch church really exists. All the locations in the legend of Sleepy Hollow are real. Most of the people based on real historic characters. In fact, two of the characters from the story, Katrina Van Tassel and a fellow named Abraham Martling, who is the model for Brom Bones, the bully who runs Ichabod Crane out of town, all buried in that cemetery, along allegedly with the Headless Hessian.
And that's what gives the book such a verisimilitude as well, too. You go to that town and you can see it's as if the book has, come alive, that kind of thing, because it's based upon some semblance of fact. The people, like, you could go back to that town probably shortly after Irving wrote the book, and they would say, we can show you the grave over here, and it becomes a part of legend building and a part of myth building as well, too. You set it in a recognizable scenario, and everything makes sense, and you start accepting it without question because it has its place in time and space.
And the funny thing about the legend, too, is that a lot of people, as I say, just like we were talking about with Dracula and Frankenstein, a lot of people have not read Washington Irving's original story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It's fairly short. It's, depending on the edition you read and the size of the typeface, it's less than 80 pages long. It's not a novel. It's a short story. It was part of a much larger collection called the Sketchbook, written in 1819, published originally in America in 1820. And the funny thing about the story is that when we hear the legend of Sleepy Hollow, everybody knows what you're talking about. You're talking about the legend of Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman. It's a ghost story, except what's fascinating is the actual story doesn't have much of that ghost story in it. The ghost story comes in right at the end. Most of it is a travelogue. Most of it is a list of places, recipes, and livestock, which sounds terribly boring, but surprisingly it's not. Washington Irving was a satirist, and he wanted to write a story that captured his love of the Hudson River Valley. So he wrote about the people, he wrote about the architecture, he wrote about his favorite foods and the joy of riding on a horse through this beautiful landscape. But he thought, you know what, that's going to be boring as all get out. So he said, I'm going to weave some local folk tales into it. And so he took some great local folk tales, like the ghost of the White Lady of Raven Rock, the ghost of Major Andre, who was a revolutionary spy who was hung by the Americans.
Yes.
And the legend of the Headless Hessian, and wove them all into this story and came up with a wonderful climax where the Headless Hessian chases Ichabod out of town and leaves you definitely with a wink and a nod, because I believe, and I apologize, spoiler alert for the world here, that in the story, despite the fact that the legend of the Headless Horseman is a very real legend, in the story, the Headless Horseman who chases Ichabod out of town is almost certainly Brom Bones wearing a costume. And I think that he wants you to know that, but he also knows that as a reader, you want the ghost story. So he gives you that little wink at the end and leaves you with some room for doubt, so that if you want to believe in the ghost, you can believe in the ghost. If you want to believe it was all just a prank, you can believe it's a prank. He leaves it up to the reader. And I think that's a wonderful little wink at the end.
It is. It is. And it's an amazing book. And I can't recommend it enough, because if nothing else, just what you undertook to just, again, get to the bottom of a legend. What is there about this? Because I think that we all know at some point that this is based on a true person, very much so. We talked about Vlad Tepes. We talked about the von Frankensteins, if you don't mind my blazing saddles, the Frankensteins. And now you have a Hessian soldier as at the heart of one of the most iconic legends, one that will live on forever. So I applaud you, Chris, and I've said this before, for your industriousness on this. Plus, I mean, come on, you saw some great things in Europe, so.
I did. I did. It was a great trip, and I tell you, I'm glad sometimes that I have absolutely no impulse control, because common sense wouldn't have sent me, over there, but I did it anyway. And I think that finding that record was, I don't know, that's probably going to be, it's probably, I could just call it quits now, because that was the one thing I'll probably never top. So.
And didn't you tell me that you had some great pizza in Germany or something like that?
I did. I have to tell you, the little town, the town of Marburg is the town of Marburg. If you ever find yourself in Germany, visit Marburg. Absolutely, it's a hilltop town with a castle right at the top of the hill in the center. You can't go anywhere in town and not see this big, beautiful castle at the top of the hill. It was where Willem and Jacob Grimm studied. They went to university there at Universität Philipps, I believe, and did all their study in folklore. Everywhere you walk around the city, you come onto these little courtyards that have stone statues and fountains that are taken right out of Grimm's folklore. So I mean, as a folklore nut, of course, being in that town was just magical. And the fact that it happened to contain the secret of the Headless Horseman was just a little bit of a bonus. But yeah, good pizza, good pizza, fantastic sandwiches, great coffee. I'd move there in a heartbeat.
Yeah,
I'm glad you got to experience it before you couldn't travel wise.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I had the privilege of living in Germany for 3 years while I was in the military in southern Bavaria in Augsburg, which is about an hour west of Munich, and we would go down to Garmisch-Partenkirchen, which is right by the border to Switzerland, and same thing, phenomenal pizza. And it's one of those towns, and if you guys ever just want to Google it, good luck spelling Garmisch-Partenkirchen. But it is a fantastic little area where people paint their entire family history on the sides of the buildings.
That's just amazing.
Yeah, the whole country is just one big adventure. But again, as we're rounding down, we got about 3 minutes left here. Something I've said to people time and again, that the only thing we get to take with us into the next life is our postcards, our memories, and getting a chance to travel and go to these incredible places and having amazing experiences, whether it be the food, the culture, just what you experience through your eyes and your feet. It can just be magical, absolutely magical. So I commend you guys both for having that spirit of adventure.
Very much so.
So
it's a labor of love, I'll tell you.
Keep swimming, guys. Keep swimming.
Christopher, in about 60 seconds worth, what's coming up for you in 2022? What do you have plans to be doing, sir?
My big plan for 2022, currently I'm furloughed for the winter, things being a little bit down in my industry, which is the hospitality industry. And so that gives me some time for writing. I'm hammering away on Hunting Dracula, and the big climax that will hopefully, assuming that travel remains open, will be my trip to Whitby. And then actually part of my Whitby trip, I like to get 2-for-1s, is to travel to Croglan in the north of England to investigate yet another piece of vampire folklore that I've always been fascinated by. So look up the Vampire of Croglan Village, Croglan, Croglin. I'm going to spend a couple of days up in Croglan, the rest of the time on the coast in Whitby, and hopefully come back with 2 good vampire stories.
Excellent.
Because why not?
Exactly. And Mr. Ronald Murphy, sir, what do we see in your future?
I'm going to be working on a couple of programs, a couple of the small town monster programs by Seth Breedlove.
Oh,
I'm going to be working on, the American Werewolf is the one that I'm really looking forward to. And then there's going to be another one that is going to be based upon my area here, the Chestnut Ridge. So I'm looking forward to the world opening up a little bit. I'm looking forward to getting back into conferences and talking to people, because I miss that so desperately.
Yeah.
And
Ron, if you ever want to talk werewolves, it's near and dear to my heart. I'd love to talk about some of the Paleolithic origins of werewolf folklore with you.
Well, gentlemen, I would think this is my proposal. I think that we should all get together, and I think we should all get bat tattoos. Does that sound like a good idea?
Yes.
It would be kind of like this fraternity of the order of the vampire, and I think that would be a good thing. I would love to sit down in a room with all 4 of us together and just talk the night away. I think that would be a good idea.
Are we talking back tattoos, or are we talking tramp stamps? The lower back area.
I don't, George. I'll tell you what. I think the tramp stamp actually makes out a pretty good idea. But we'll get matching bat tattoos, and then if anybody, I'm all for this.
There would have to be There would
That's
have
right.
to be there would have to be alcohol involved. So I know
Onyx.
Why wouldn't there be?
Yeah. Onyx moonshine and nothing else.
and Bavarian beer. Yo,
Yes.
Yes.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a fantastic and fast 2 hours. We definitely looking forward to having you back again here in the near future. Don't hang up your cameras yet. We're going to take it to the end of the show right now. But I thank everybody for joining us. As always, hit that subscribe button. Don't forget that thumbs up, very important, and a reminder bell for upcoming content. Check out the new show, Extremely Strange, right here on the Dead Air Full Spectrum channel. My name is George Lopez. With me, as always, Mr. Ken DaCosta. Have a great week, guys. We'll see you same time next week. Good night.
Good night.